It is a system that is bidirectional with the gut and the brain. They are in continuous communication, and we will talk a little now about the different communication pathways that exist between the gut and the brain. What I meant to say is that any impairment occurring at the intestinal level will produce an effect at the nervous system level and vice versa. Therefore, any emotional disturbance we experience will affect our digestion at the time of 2001 and intestinal transit. Many times, when we get nervous, we have some emotional attachment, and we can feel a knot in our stomach, even up here, which is called a hysterical bolus, and occurs like a plug or a lump in the throat. It will affect us when it comes to going to the bathroom. Some people experience more diarrhea. In the end, everything that happens in the nervous system will be reflected at the intestinal level. Conversely, any impairment at the intestinal level, which we will examine in more detail now, and any alteration at the microbiota level directly influences the nervous system because it ultimately traverses the entire digestive mucosa. So any alteration in the bacteria, which is ultimately what this entire master's program is about, and in that intestinal mucosa, will later affect the production of neurotransmitters. Now we will talk about serotonin, dopamine, and others. Any defect at the digestive level, any alteration at the intestinal level will directly affect the nervous system, cognitive function, memory, and concentration. There is a very characteristic symptom, which is head fog or mental fog, that often occurs when we have digestive problems. I am very tired. I have digestive issues such as bloating, gas, discomfort when digesting. I am not going to the bathroom, and so on. And I also feel that fog, that difficulty in being able to concentrate, to organize things, or to think. So this will indicate inflammation of the nervous system, a neuroinflammation, which we will be able to discuss later. And it is directly responsible for the part of the intestinal mucosa and the microbiota in this type of symptoms. As I was saying, the entire digestive mucosa is covered by cells and by a barrier. Enterocytes, which are the main cells of the intestine, need to be tightly packed together and act as a barrier against the entry of all toxins or waste from digestion, or even pathogens that we may have at the intestinal level, or alterations in that microbiota. The blood-brain barrier, which ultimately serves as a protector in the nervous system, directly depends on the state of the intestinal barrier. Depending on the permeability of the gut, we will have the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Both barriers regulate the entry or non-entry of nutrients, toxins, and metabolites at the nervous system level. At the intestinal level, the greater the intestinal permeability we have, the more entry of toxins, digestive residues, antigens, bacteria, etc. And since the entire digestive tract is covered by those neurons, that nervous system will be directly affected. So, if we have the gut well closed with its mobile layer and the microbiota is regulated, the barrier function will work perfectly. Here we will have the nervous system and the mucosal immune system. If the barrier is intact, the nervous system will not be affected. And in the immune system, if the barrier opens and there is an increase in intestinal permeability, all the entry of toxins, waste, food antigens, and pathogens that was mentioned will occur. And the first thing we have is the alteration of the nervous system, where there will be an overexcitation of both the nervous system and the immune system. Inflammation of that nervous system, which, as I mentioned before, will impact the entire central nervous system, with alterations at the cognitive level, immune level, digestive level, because one feeds off the other at the level of rest and at the level of mood. Now let's talk a little bit about dopamine and serotonin. It's like a vicious cycle. If the nervous system is disrupted, all digestive processes will not be carried out correctly. And if the digestive processes, microbiota, or barrier function are altered, the nervous system will be directly affected in an endless cycle. Therefore, it is important to restore the barrier function at both the intestinal level and the central nervous system level, as well as at the blood-brain barrier level, to prevent the entry of toxins that can harm the entire organism. As I was saying, there are several forms of communication between the enteric nervous system, the digestive system, and the central nervous system. One that is the most important or the most striking is, as I said, the vagus nerve, or the whole part of the millions of neurons. The pelvic final nerves, the entire part of the vagus nerve, and the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are involved in that communication. But as I was saying, we don't only communicate this way. We have 4 pathways. The pathway of the nervous system, the endocrine pathway, which is called neuroendocrine, and the immune pathway at the end of all the production of inflammatory substances mentioned earlier from the immune mucosal system found in the intestine. Therefore, alterations in the intestine will lead to a disruption at the level of the immune system and obviously affect the entire metabolic aspect of the metabolites, those substances produced by the intestinal bacteria. For better or for worse, it is ultimately very important to maintain a balance in the intestinal microbiota precisely because of those metabolites. When we have an alteration of the intestinal microbiota or an overgrowth of facultative or opportunistic pathogens, they will produce more neurotoxic metabolites that ultimately lead to a disturbance of the nervous system or neuroinflammation. Hormones, which we will also discuss now, are produced at the intestinal level, along with neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine, which obviously have a significant influence on the nervous system. Okay. Well, we will see it later. There are 2 very important axes regarding short-chain fatty acids. The production of short-chain fatty acids by the microbiota through dietary fiber directly influences the central nervous system because it regulates the overall functioning of the nervous system and also acts as fuel at both the microbiota level and the nervous system level. It is very important to regulate this microbiota and keep it in balance for the correct production of short-chain fatty acids to ensure proper functioning of the nervous system. Another important axis is the one we have at the level of the kidneys, adrenal glands, and hypothalamus, which will also regulate the entire aspect, especially of satiety or hunger, or the stress hormone, cortisol. When we have an excessive production of cortisol by the adrenal glands, that cortisol will obviously produce neuroinflammation and disrupt the entire pituitary gland and hypothalamus, which ultimately regulates the endocrine part of the organism. So what I was saying is that there are several forms of communication, not just the vagus nerve, but the entire endocrine and hormonal system is also a major communicator between the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. I have put here and I will name some of the bacteria, although we will talk more about foods, but some of the bacteria that have the most impact on the nervous system. One of them is rhamnosus, which is closely related to lower levels of corticosterone and better control of cortisol, or better control of stress and depression. Now we will talk a bit about psychobiotics, which we will explore further. Nothing, as I was saying, all the intestinal bacteria will directly impact what we think. There is something I call mental noise that occurs a lot when we have a mismatch of those bacteria. I insist a lot in the consultation that many times our thoughts do not depend on us. The more imbalance we have at the intestinal level with viruses, bacteria, or candida fungi, the more mental noise we will experience. In other words, when we have a mismatch, even an overgrowth, for example, of proteolytic bacteria or candida, those neurotoxic metabolites I mentioned earlier will greatly influence our way of thinking and will lead to more negative, even obsessive thoughts. The imbalance of the intestinal microbiota directly influences how we feel in terms of mood, not only in the production of dopamine and serotonin, but as I mentioned, it also contributes to mental fog and difficulty concentrating, and especially to having many negative thoughts. Well, now I have outlined a bit here how conditions such as depression, even autism and anxiety are affected at the pathological level, how these states are directly altered by a disruption of the microbiota, which is directly related to an increase in histamine production as a consequence of intestinal permeability. It is very important when we have anxiety or a depression disorders without an apparent reason to treat the gut and conduct a thorough stool and microbiota analysis in order to regulate these bacteria. I also wanted to mention, although I won't go into this too much, that in the case of the clinician I mentioned, the patient had a quite active virus. I wanted to highlight the relationship we have with the activation of certain viruses, especially slow viruses such as herpes, Epstein-Barr, and cytomegalovirus, and their connection to neurodegenerative diseases or conditions like depression and anxiety. There are increasingly more studies, especially with Eisenbach, related to pathologies such as multiple sclerosis or whatever it may be at a neurodegenerative level. And we see a lot in the clinic when patients come in with diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, how there has been reactivation of those viruses. So we not only have to focus on bacteria and candida, conducting a thorough study of viruses will also help us to treat pathologies, especially at the level of neuroinflammation. Okay, how can we know if we are experiencing neuroinflammation? In the end, as I was saying, the entire nervous system and the immune system are related. There is a tissue called microglia, which is the immune system of the nervous system. There are many symptoms that will indicate neuroinflammation, but we do not have to experience all of them. Let's say the nervous system does not directly produce pain from the nerve in general. We do not need to have a headache or an alteration of the trigeminal nerve or nerve pain to experience neuroinflammation, but that neuroinflammation will produce an alteration in the entire organism. Because in the end, if I have neuroinflammation, when a tissue is inflamed, it is like overstimulated, so it will lead to a disruption of its function. When there is a disturbance in the nervous system, a neuroinflammation, small stimuli will cause an overreaction. For example, if I hit my hand here, it doesn't bother me right now if I have inflammation in my hand, but if you do it lightly, it will hurt you. Well, it's the same at the level of the organism. If I have a balanced and non-inflamed nervous system, stimuli will not produce a reaction in me. If there is neuroinflammation, any stimulus will increase that sensitivity. For example, I have noted that in fibromyalgia, neuroinflammation and small stimuli will produce headaches, exhaustion, fatigue, disturbances in the nervous system, and pain throughout the body. In this type of pathology, it is extremely relevant to treat the intestine, assist in detoxification, and reduce inflammation of the nervous system. It will also cause an alteration of the hypothalamus. We have previously discussed the gut hypothalamus and adrenal hypothalamus axis. When there is a disturbance in the nervous system, it will lead to an alteration in the hypothalamus, affecting the part related to hunger or satiety. So most patients with obesity, apart from having an alteration of the intestinal microbiota, also experience liver overload and several other issues. A subclinical inflammation will lead to neuroinflammation of the hypothalamus, which will prevent proper regulation of satiety and hunger. We may also experience fatigue, especially after meals. It doesn't have to be after meals. It often presents with chronic fatigue. However, when we demand extra effort from the digestive system to carry out the digestion processes, since the vagus nerve is primarily responsible for that, if it is neuroinflammatory, we will produce a lot. And that need to lie down or take a nap after meals, as I mentioned before, mental fatigue, that dullness or depression or the difficulty in thinking. By altering the hypothalamus, we will not be able to control those impulses, that anxiety with food, or the desire to turn to food to calm our mood. We will be able to have binge eating. Could we include ourselves in that group of diseases, of eating disorders? I mentioned it before. The negative sensations, or what I call the mental noise of bad thoughts, stress, or fear, panic, right? Even people who self-harm due to that inflammation of the nervous system. We have talked before about chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. Every autoimmune pathology is associated with neuroinflammation and an alteration of the intestinal microbiota and intestinal permeability. Insomnia, obviously, we have said, is responsible for all aspects of rest and any neurodegenerative diseases. Ultimately, any impact or symptom of the nervous system will indicate that there is inflammation of that nerve, of that system, Therefore, it is important to address it. What are the causes? There are many causes that can produce inflammation in the body, in this case, the nervous system. The alteration of the microbiota. First of the mothers, there are babies who can be born with a neuroinflammatory nervous system because we acquire the microbiota from the mother. Then it is necessary to consider whether the child was breastfed or not, the type of delivery they had, or if the child had to take antibiotics from a young age or had a transit alteration, among other factors. But I can already see that there are babies born with an inflamed nervous system. And it also depends on the type of pregnancy that was experienced. There may have been contact with many toxins, or there was already an accumulation of toxins. It is very important to prepare for pregnancy at all levels, including microbiota, inflammation, and toxins, because they cross the placenta and reach the baby directly, significantly influencing its neurodevelopment. Chronic stress and emotional stress are among the major causes that will lead to inflammation of the nervous system. We have said that inflammation occurs when there is a disruption, and in this case, the nervous system has to work harder. So if we have excessive production of cortisol, we are continuously on the defensive, causing the tissue to become inflamed in order to work harder. It is very important to learn how to regulate that stress. We will talk a little bit about gluten after all this. I haven't focused much on talking about gluten in today's class, but the intake of gluten, especially when there is gluten sensitivity, which we will discuss a little bit later, does not necessarily have to involve celiac disease, but the proteins in gluten often act as antigens. So if there is a mismatch in the intestinal microbiota or an alteration of the intestinal barrier, those fragments of proteins that are not fully digested in the intestine will enter through the barrier and directly affect the nervous system. So when there are neurodegenerative or neuronal pathologies, it would be important to avoid the consumption of gluten. Sensitivity tests for gluten can be done. But when there is an autoimmune pathology or an alteration related to neuroinflammation, I try to have them avoid gluten consumption as much as possible. High blood sugar levels, any alteration in blood levels, ultimately leads to overexcitation and direct inflammation. It is very important to learn to regulate sugar spikes and to avoid both highs and lows. This is relatively easy if we learn to combine foods well, mixing carbohydrates, proteins, and beneficial fats. And especially avoiding the consumption of processed foods or refined flours, sweets, sugars, etc. Be careful with fruits. We have a habit of either not eating any fruit or eating too much fruit. So fruit contains sugar because it is fruit. So consuming 7 pieces of fruit daily is not good either. In the end, it leads to an excess of sugar that we consume. And if we do not combine them well, as I mentioned, it will cause hyperglycemia, which will produce an immune and nervous system overexcitation, resulting in inflammation. Don't worry about the excessive consumption of foods that are very high in carbohydrates. All the issues related to poor circulation and lack of antioxidants. Now let's talk a little about what we can incorporate into our diet. For example, ginkgo biloba and blueberries will help us a lot with the polyphenols and antioxidants they contain, which can reduce neuroinflammation. That poor circulation, especially of microcirculation, and the lack of antioxidants will lead to inflammation of the nervous system. We have previously discussed the function of the intestinal barrier and the blood-brain barrier. Obviously, the alteration of the enteric nervous system and pathogenic agents, which we have seen before, such as mainly viruses or certain bacteria and fungi, will produce their neurotoxic metabolites, leading to inflammation of the nervous system.